Thank you very much, Katie and Jim. So, as Katie said, what I want to talk to you about today is what globalization actually in today's context means for the leadership cultures that you create and how you develop your executives the world over. Before I get into that, just a little bit about the context. I came across a Chinese saying, which is, it's better to be a cockroach in a time of stability than a man. The ancient Chinese weren't very politically correct in a time of chaos. And if you look at the world today, there's plenty of reasons, I think, if you look at all the things that are happening in the world, why tomorrow morning you might decide to wake up and prefer to be a cockroach instead of a human. Because there are huge currents sweeping our world. So when I go and talk to global CEOs and leaders, two things emerge with amazing regularity. The first is, CEOs will say, we've never known a time when it's been more important for our companies to go after global opportunities and to really explore the performance possibilities in different markets. But the second thing they'll say is, we've never known a time when the pursuit of those opportunities was fraught with so much challenge, uncertainty, and risk. So if we take just some of the things that have happened to our clients recently, the Eurozone crisis erupted and continues to rumble on and is having a tremendous impact on the European performance of many multinationals. Ebola came out of nowhere and affected African business. The UK might in 2 years' time pull out of the EU. China decided 2 years ago, on a whim seemingly, that the consumption of Western luxury goods was not something that they wanted their leaders and affluent people to be exhibiting. And that led to a big fall in the opportunities in those markets. Lots and lots of things like that, the oil price crash, the currency movements, which are so volatile, means that global leaders are now operating in a new context. But actually, the challenge isn't just for global business leaders. If we think about, the way ISIS has come from nowhere, the fractioning of Middle Eastern states, Putin, Ukraine, and our Western response. Stephen Hawking said, actually, the world's going mad, and unless we develop a degree of cultural intelligence and empathy, we're heading for the rocks. So I think this challenge isn't just a challenge for business leaders, it's a challenge for our society as a whole. I want to present some data that we've collected at YSC, but before I do that, just a couple of sort of themes. The first thing is, we've worked with a lot of multinationals all over the world, and the first thing I'd say is there's no such thing as a truly global multinational. Each company's culture is firmly rooted in the domestic environment in which it originated. And I can illustrate that a little bit by taking companies that come from the Western world and that have been operating on a global stage probably for longer than most. If you take American and European companies, so the American versions would be P&G, GE, Coca-Cola, Mars, etc. And you compare them to their European versions, such as Unilever or Nestle, I argue that for various deep-seated cultural reasons, the American mode of globalization is to develop a clear model, a clear product, and then roll it out relatively unthinkingly worldwide. And all these companies do that, and they do that with skill and with some strength. The European model is much more flexible, much more tailored to different environments. Each of those leads to different strengths and weaknesses in the new global environment. But actually, the point that I would make here is you need to reflect upon the default cultural settings of your companies and recognize that they're not going to be truly global, a lot of your leadership cultures in a lot of respects, and understand the strengths and weaknesses of those default settings. The second point I want to make is about the paradox of similarity and difference. At one level, the global world is pulling us all into a shared community. Global business leaders go to the same business schools. They, modern advertising and communication is creating commonality of need in consumers. But actually, when we go and talk around the world to leaders in different parts, they say the longer you're here, the more that you see difference. Now, there are times when you have to accept similarity, and we've often argued with our clients around leadership programs that they thought wouldn't work in different environments. You go there and you find people are people, etc., etc., etc. But at other times, leaders have to be very sensitive to nuance and under-the-skin difference. And that's something that you can't teach at business school. So a muscle that you need to develop in your leaders is the ability to know, when do I assume that the world is similar and we can impose global values, and when do I recognize that I need to look under the surface and do something different? Now, that may seem theoretical, but if we look at 2 or 3 of the most cataclysmic events that have affected UK companies on the global stage, BP and its problems in America, GSK and its problems in China, HSBC and its problems in Switzerland. We work with all those companies, and I would say they are some of the most values-driven companies in their sectors. But the mistake that they made as they globalized was they assumed, and this is a British approach to globalization, is to give quite a lot of freedom, quite a lot of flex, not look under the surface, to really kick the tires of what's going on. And the failure to do that has had significant impact on those, on the reputation and the performance of those companies in certain markets. The other thing I want to say is that if we're serious about globalization and we look at most global companies, the vast majority of them, the leadership teams are consisting of middle-aged, white, Anglo-Saxon males. Yeah, let's be honest. And you can't engage the challenges of the new global ecology without really appreciating the strengths of leaders from different cultures. We're increasingly seeing that the Western-dominated business model, which is quite analytical, quite structured, quite planful, quite thoughtful, actually can be strong in some contexts, but can really be leaden, wooden, inflexible, and slow around change, given the dynamics of the world that we live in. And when I talk to leaders from emerging markets, the number one complaint that they'll have of Western organizations is how slow they are, how bureaucratic they are, how much they sort of talk versus act. So genuine appreciation of the strengths of the leadership cultures of other environments is necessary. You need to do that if you're to release potential in different markets, which is a huge challenge for organizations, in a way that is consistent with the strengths of that culture rather than imposing your own. And it's not easy. The whole research on unconscious bias says that however liberal or open-minded we are, when we measure your reaction times, your recall, or your neuropsychological responses, people have a huge amount of unconscious bias or some very strong assumptions that their way is the only way of doing things. So genuine appreciation of difference is not an easy thing to achieve, but is necessary. And when you're thinking about your leadership default settings as a culture, when you're thinking about whether to drive similarity or common values or flex to local cultures, when you're thinking about what you respect in your culture and what you respect in other cultures, all that's got to be done in the context of the ecology of the new business environment. And I've talked about the change and the turbulence of it. That's one theme. A second theme is that all business leaders will say the global world used to, is no longer a case of sending people to certain markets, giving them huge levels of autonomy and letting them get on with things. Global connectivity across the companies is necessary in order to leverage opportunity and difference. A third aspect of context, which is incredibly important, is the compact between business and society has been broken in a lot of parts of the world. And so businesses have to operate with a very keen eye on what the political context is. And actually, Other countries are much, much harder on overseas companies that have violated their values than they are on their local companies. So that's a hugely important aspect of the current global context that you have to be sensitive to. Now, with those provisos, I'm going to move into some sort of data. What we've done is, YSC, by the way, are there people here who use YSC at all? Stick your hands up if you do. Yeah? Oh, quite a few, actually. That's quite good. How many of you have been assessed by us? Anyone? Oh, bloody hell, right. Well, you know what? I brought a number of your reports along, and I was going to share them, if you don't mind, just to illustrate, our process and what you can get out of it. But anyway, we've got 20 offices around the world, and we've been assessing leaders, and we've been writing reports. And we took reports from the last 2 years or so from predominantly global companies, but there were global companies from all parts of the world. We took 200 leaders from Europe, from the USA, China, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Middle East as well. And we content analyzed them for strengths and weaknesses. And really it provides a picture of what are the strengths that today's global executive has, in the modern world, but what are some of the sort of development areas? If I move on to the 6 top strengths, you recognize quite a lot of these. By the way, I'm not going to talk too much about cultural differences. I'll allude to some, but there's an HBR article in this May's HBR that talks, that gives some of the data on how the differences show up. So, you won't be surprised. Achievement, drive, and ambition was the number 1 strength. Our global executives are highly driven. And actually, if you're on the global stage, you need to be more intensely driven. The hours, the calling, the different time zones, etc. Leaders from emerging markets were the strongest in this area. And actually, leaders from Europe were the weakest with respect to sort of achievement drive. That's not necessarily a problem, because actually intense achievement does raise issues that we commonly see around resilience, sustainability, the meaning and purpose of work life. Those questions we found to be less present in the emerging market leaders, but when I talked about it in my previous book, Meaning Inc., lots of European executives, and we got the quote that we quoted there, the wheel's still spinning but the hamster's dead, sort of a view of what business life is like in modern sort of organizations. But achievement drive, commercial thinking. Actually, Middle Eastern executives were the strongest in this area, a strong tradition in that region of commerciality and trading, etc. But other cultures were equally strong. It's a strength, but actually, in the modern ecology of the world, potentially a weakness, because if you drive narrow commercial goals at the risk of sort of some values, you can be really caught offside. Responsibility, duty, rule following. Our leaders are quite good at sort of putting clear values in. Analytical thinking, the default setting is analyze things. If there's a question, produce data, do presentations, charts, etc., etc., etc. Our business schools, at our global business schools, have really inundated this. There's a strength associated with that, but there's some weaknesses. Action orientation, quick to act, etc. And positivity, actually, a lot of positivity. Positivity, we found, is like the sun. It goes east to west. So Americans and Latin Americans are really strong. Africans and Europeans are in the middle. And actually, in the Far East, executives are perhaps the least strong. Interestingly, there's a lot of reasons for positivity, but actually, one of the things I talk about in my book is that sometimes there are genetic reasons. So 2 genes associated with serotonin, one with oxytocin, have been linked to optimism and a sense of mastery, etc. And actually, like the sun, they follow an east-west pattern. It's really interesting how it turns up in our data. But you'll recognize this picture of the global executive. I don't know, has anyone ever seen a film called The Coca-Cola Kid from ages ago? I remember it because Greta Scacchi's in it, and she goes around with, not much on for quite a lot of the film. But that's not the reason I remember it. I remember it because it has important lessons for leadership. And what it is this whiz kid Coca-Cola executive is sent to a sleepy part of Australia to turn around the performance of the business. He's so efficient, he arrives before the fax announcing his appointment is there. He produces lots of charts, he's really action-oriented, he's gung-ho, he's absolutely determined to change the performance of the company, and he runs into the brick wall of Australian, slightly laid-back culture, and his competitor, who's old Bill so-and-so, who goes around in a truck dropping sort of beverages around. And when he asks to review the distribution strategy, they produce some old codger in a truck to meet him, and who says he goes around dropping crates off on a whim. And the whole film is about this guy's education, about how you can't take that approach to business and just drop it around the world. And that gets me neatly to the top 6 challenges for sort of global leaders. The number 1 challenge that we found was relational, broader influencing, and networking. Our global executives need to be well connected internally. They deal with cultures that are very, very relational. And the other interesting thing we found here was leaders from emerging markets were more challenged by this than were Western leaders, which is kind of surprised given that they come from relational cultures. The essential point that we discover this time and time again is that the leadership culture that we create in global businesses requires a lot of relationships, but relatively shallow or, purposeful, as opposed to people from these cultures are used to much closer relationships with people in their intimate circles. So leaders from these environments are genuinely at sea when navigating the relational world of a global multinational and need quite a lot of help. So when you're plucking people out of China and Africa and things like that, we've seen it again and again. They struggle because part of the reason they struggle is this. There's a Chinese saying, Westerners treat strangers like their family and their family like strangers, which captures that topsy-turvy world that people from highly relational cultures experience in the Western multinational. Intellectual flexibility and openness. We found emerging market leaders were very strong. African leaders were the strongest in this. And actually, it's a big challenge for European and Western leaders. The level of flexibility and openness required for engaging global opportunities in today's environment is immense. Wider strategic thinking. So that's thinking about the political context. And actually, we also found it's usually a long haul to try and succeed in global markets. Success isn't instantaneous. You have to work away at it. Inclusive two-way leadership style, a massive issue. How do you think about co-opting people to your agenda in different markets? How do you get under the skin? How do you mobilize people? European leaders were the strongest in this. Empathy, real empathy. There's some really interesting research that I quote in my book on mirror neuron research. Mirror neurons are the neurons in your brain that give you empathy. So if somebody pricks their finger, you wince, and etc. They're designed to develop empathy. Interesting thing about experiments across cultures is if you show white people a black hand being pricked, the mirror neurons hardly fire compared to if a white hand, and vice versa. So the development of empathy. We've got empathy suppression mechanisms when we're engaging different groups. So the development of empathy is a huge issue. And self-awareness and insight. We found that, leaders who are able to operate around the world, be flexible, have a grounded sense of self-insight. And again, we found people from highly relational cultures were much more challenged in this area because they're less used to thinking about themselves as discrete entities and as individuals. So working on these things and looking at your development programs and emphasizing this for your global executives, I think is going to be helpful. I'm not going to sort of say too much here, but just in the book, another thing we talk about is getting under the skin of different cultures, and by that. I mean, really understanding the cultural DNA themes in each culture. And in the book, I expand on about 5 or 6 for each nation. They're deeply embedded. And we've tended to sort of think about difference on dimensions and the Hofstadter dimensions and other things. My view is that you only really get under the skin by really getting into each culture, its distinctive features, and why they're there, and you only develop respect and empathy if through doing that. I've run out of time, but I could go into some of the genetics and some of the influences that really drive some of these deeply held beliefs and assumptions, and there's 5 or 6 for each culture. The final point I'm going to sort of, though there's a bit of a plug for the book, but I didn't actually necessarily want that up. But the final point I want to make is about our country and global. Every country in the world faces a challenge around global competitiveness. And I think our country is uniquely placed by virtue of its history. We're in the EU, we have connections with America, Africa, India, China. We are uniquely placed to be the global connector economy. And if we're going to give our people the standard of living, you know, and that they've historically enjoyed, and to keep it sustained in a globally competitive world, I think it's not just good business practice, but it's good for our country to be developing the leadership cultures that can really capitalize on this spirit of globalization. I've tried to argue in the political world that we should be sending, you know, our youngsters out, even for a year or so, to different environments and getting them back in to really make that work for us. But, you know, as you know, we can start at company culture, and it's relevant for our success as a nation as much as it's relevant for the success of your companies. So thank you very much.
Got a couple of questions, so we'll see what the All right, can we bring up the poll? The question, hopefully on your screen, should have been: do your leaders have the right skills to step into the global stage? Yes or no? How did our audience vote? Let's have a quick look at this.
One of the things I think, you know, as a society and as a country we could do is get you talking to the companies, because companies, what I've noticed, are at different stages of embracing globalization, and there are many great companies in the UK who've done that, learnt some lessons the hard way. You need to be talking, because there's no substitute for experience here, and you can send your executives out and they can learn and experience, but actually, why don't you learn off the experience of others, because there's lots of stories, lots of things around success, but lots of ways in which people have tripped up as well that you need to encourage.
Gurnek, one question for you. What lessons have you personally learnt the hard way in any part of the world?
Personally? Well, when I first started in consulting, I'd moved from clinical psychology to consulting. And we're working for this American firm. And they had, their performance had been really poor for about 10 years. And we were in the London office, and there were some European offices. So we got all invited to this get-together in Miami, and we expected this would be a really sober, good, rigorous look at the issues facing the company. But we were surprised because it felt like an evangelical sort of, really glad, positive sort of whatever. And the CEO stood up and he articulated his really ambitious goals for the future. And we've sitting there, and the guy next to me just gently asked a question. Said, "Well, that's very good, but given our trajectory, what are we going to do to, achieve those goals?" And then later on, we all got taken aside by the European manager. So the CEO was fuming mad with the Europeans. He said they're being negative, they're being pessimistic, and he said, and we thought we were just being thoughtful around the place. And he said they're going around lighting. There have been terrorists in this organisation. They're lighting fires all over the place. And the Europeans said, "You guys are in real trouble. He's so mad. This could be terminal for your sort of careers." Actually, oddly enough, 6 months later, a couple of us did leave, and we set up YSE, right? Because we were getting this sense of sort of cultural clash. But that was European, what we thought authenticity, but it was landing up against American positivity. And some of the lessons that we have for American leaders is your positivity is great in some situations, but it can really land in a different way, and is inauthenticity, airbrushing away of problems, etc., in parts of the world.
So if you get it wrong, you need to be prepared to start your own company.
Yeah, well, it was a seminal moment, because we thought, you know what, we're not going to progress in this place with our attitude. This is a highly America-centric company. And actually, over time, we built a firm that was actually, I mean, it sounds immodest, but much more successful than them. And we built it by being globally flexible. We built it by being really sensitive about the kind of culture that we created. They never, ever were able to expand out of America because every time they did, they would impose their American values, and that just didn't work in the kind of context that we were operating in, and their offices would come and go. So that was that's a lesson. Yeah.
Okay. Gurnek, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.